It lay beneath Egypt's sand for over 3,000 years, sealed and undisturbed until 1922, when Howard Carter opened that doorway and looked inside and said he saw wonderful things. What came out of that chamber became one of the most recognizable faces in the ancient world, a golden mask, calm, flawless, eternal, at least in the museum lighting. But the face behind that mask was nothing like the legend suggested. For decades, the leading explanation for why a 19-year-old pharaoh died came down to a single detail: a hole at the back of his skull and a theory that he had been murdered, struck down by those who wanted his throne. 21st century genetic science did not simply disprove that theory, it replaced it with something considerably stranger and considerably more human, a story written directly into his own DNA, waiting 3,000 years to finally be read. For decades, the leading explanation for Tutankhamun's death at 19 centered entirely on a single anatomical detail: a hole discovered at the back of his skull, examined by researchers long before modern imaging technology existed to properly interpret what it actually meant. For years, that hole was read as evidence of violence. A blow to the head, delivered deliberately, the physical signature of a palace assassination carried out by whoever wanted the young king's throne for themselves. Think about why that particular theory held on for so long, because it is worth understanding directly. A 19-year-old pharaoh, dead with no clear explanation, sitting at the center of one of the most politically unstable periods in Egyptian royal history, immediately following his father's radical religious upheaval. A contested throne. A young, vulnerable king. It had every ingredient a compelling murder story requires: a perpetrator with motive, a victim with no power to defend himself, a skull fracture that seemed on the surface to confirm exactly what the political situation already suggested must have happened. For decades, that theory was not simply floated as one possibility among several. It was treated in popular retellings and even in some academic circles as something close to settled fact. A murdered boy king, killed for his crown, his death covered up by whoever benefited most from his absence. But a theory built on political plausibility alone is not the same thing as a theory confirmed by physical evidence. And eventually, the tools needed to actually test that specific claim directly against the physical remains themselves finally caught up with the question. The team that would eventually apply those tools was led by Zahi Hawass, Egypt's chief archaeologist, working to bring modern forensic science and genetic analysis directly to bear on mummies that had, in many cases, sat essentially unexamined by that particular standard for generations. Royal remains, treated for decades primarily as objects of historical and religious significance, were about to be studied instead with the same rigorous, evidence-based methodology any modern forensic investigation would demand. That shift mattered enormously, and it is worth sitting with directly. This was not simply a new coat of paint applied to an old, comfortable story. It was an entirely different way of asking the question in the first place, one built on isolating actual genetic material, running actual comparative analysis, and following the physical evidence wherever it genuinely led, rather than simply confirming whatever theory already sounded most dramatically satisfying. And what that team eventually found, once they actually applied that rigorous methodology directly to Tutankhamun's remains and the mummies of his closest relatives, would not simply settle the murder question one way or the other. It would end up unraveling something considerably larger and considerably more significant than a single skull fracture ever could on its own. It would unravel the genetic history of an entire royal family, one carefully extracted sample at a time, revealing a story that had nothing at all to do with assassination and everything to do with a burden this specific family had been quietly carrying, generation after generation, long before Tutankhamun himself was ever born. To understand exactly why Tutankhamun's family situation turned out to be so genetically fraught in the first place, you have to go back further than his own birth entirely, back to the reign of his grandfather. Around 1390 BCE, under Amenhotep III, Egypt sat at the absolute height of its imperial power. A vast, wealthy empire stretching from the Euphrates River in the north all the way down to the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south. This was an age defined by tradition, by stability, by a religious and political order that had held firm for generations. That stability did not survive his son's reign. When Amenhotep IV took the throne, he launched one of the most radical religious upheavals in the entire history of ancient Egypt. He rejected the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods outright, specifically targeting the powerful priesthood of Amun that had long held enormous political influence. He renamed himself Akhenaten and centered worship entirely on a single deity, the sun disk itself, known as Aten. This was not simply a change in personal religious preference. It was a genuine revolution, reshaping Egyptian religious and political life from the top down. He went so far as to relocate the entire capital away from Thebes, building an entirely new city out in the desert specifically for this new religious order, a city called Amarna. Tutankhamun was born directly into the middle of that upheaval. His original name, given at birth, was Tutankhaten, a name built directly around the new religion his father had imposed on the entire kingdom. Then his father died. And the boy who had been born Tutankhaten was crowned pharaoh at approximately 9 years old, inheriting a kingdom still reeling from an entire generation of radical religious transformation. Think about the position that put a 9-year-old child directly into. He was not simply expected to rule. He was expected to reverse an entire religious revolution his own father had spent his reign building, restoring the traditional gods his father had specifically rejected, repairing temples his father had allowed to fall into neglect, and abandoning the new capital his father had built from nothing. He changed his own name accordingly, from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, publicly signaling the restoration of Egypt's traditional religious order under his own rule. And then, at just 19 years old, he died, leaving behind no surviving heir at all. For a very long time afterward, historians and archaeologists could not say with real evidence-based certainty who Tutankhamun's parents actually were. The chaos of the Amarna period, the deliberate efforts made afterward to erase that entire era from Egyptian memory, and the simple passage of more than 3,000 years had left the young king's own immediate family history genuinely uncertain, based on inference and circumstantial historical evidence rather than direct proof. Answering that specific question definitively would require considerably more than historical records alone could ever provide. It would require going directly to the mummies themselves and asking a question ancient Egyptian scribes had never been in any position to answer on their own. For years, researchers deliberately avoided conducting genetic testing on royal Egyptian mummies at all. The risk was simply too high. Modern DNA contamination, introduced through careless handling, could compromise a sample so thoroughly that any result pulled from it would be genuinely meaningless, or worse, actively misleading. That caution held firm until the technology itself finally improved enough to make the risk manageable. In 2008, researchers established a dedicated, state-of-the-art DNA laboratory directly in the basement of the Egyptian Museum. The goal was specific and ambitious. Map Tutankhamun's actual family tree using direct genetic evidence rather than historical inference, and determine once and for all what had actually killed him. The technical difficulty involved should not be understated. Bone tissue samples were carefully extracted from 11 separate royal mummies, Tutankhamun included, but ancient Egyptian mummification itself created a genuine obstacle. The resins and oils used throughout the mummification process had, over thousands of years, degraded much of the genetic material inside those bones, and in many cases stained the remaining tissue a thick, dark black that made isolating anything usable extraordinarily difficult. For months, researchers worked painstakingly to remove that degraded black liquid and isolate genuinely usable genetic material, sample by careful sample, well aware that a single moment of contamination could compromise months of delicate work entirely. Once usable DNA was finally isolated, the first major question researchers set out to answer was straightforward to state and considerably harder to actually resolve. Who was Tutankhamun's father? Several candidates existed. His presumed grandfather, the man widely believed to be his actual father, Akhenaten himself, and a considerably more mysterious figure, a pharaoh known to history only as Smenkhkare, whose exact identity and relationship to the royal family had never been firmly established. The answer, when it finally arrived, came from an entirely unexpected source. An anonymous mummy, recovered from a genuinely strange tomb in the Valley of the Kings, designated KV55. Here's the detail that makes that specific tomb so unsettling on its own, entirely apart from whatever the DNA would eventually reveal. The names on that mummy's own coffin had been deliberately scraped away, physically removed, as though someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure this particular person would never be identified again, cursed to remain anonymous permanently. That deliberate erasure meant historians had spent decades debating who exactly was buried inside KV55, working entirely from circumstantial evidence without any way to confirm their theories directly. Genetic testing was about to change that completely, and what the DNA extracted from that anonymous, deliberately unnamed mummy would go on to reveal would not simply identify Tutankhamun's father. It would open the door directly to an even more significant and considerably more disturbing discovery, waiting on the other side of that same laboratory analysis. DNA analysis of the anonymous mummy from tomb KV55 produced a direct, unambiguous result. Y chromosome testing established a clear father and son biological relationship between the individual buried in that unnamed tomb and Tutankhamun himself. That single finding was significant enough on its own. But the same genetic analysis revealed something additional, equally important, for placing this mysterious individual correctly within the royal family tree. The testing confirmed that whoever was buried in KV55 was also the biological son of Tutankhamun's own grandparents, the same royal couple whose reign had defined Egypt's height of imperial power a generation earlier. When researchers combined that genetic evidence directly with existing historical records and careful age estimation performed on the mummy's remains, one identity fit every available piece of evidence far better than any alternative. KV55 was almost certainly Akhenaten himself, the heretic king. The pharaoh who had rejected Egypt's traditional gods renamed himself in service of a single sun deity and thrown the entire kingdom into a generation of religious upheaval. His name had been deliberately scraped from his own coffin, presumably by the same forces that spent years afterward trying to erase his entire reign from Egyptian memory. And yet, more than 3,000 years later, his own DNA identified him anyway, in a way no amount of physical erasure could ever have prevented. So Tutankhamun's father had finally been found, confirmed directly through genetic evidence rather than historical guesswork. But identifying his mother would turn out to be a considerably more disturbing discovery entirely. To locate her, researchers turned their attention to a separate mummy, one that had actually been discovered years earlier, but treated with considerably less care and attention than the story deserved. This mummy had been found in a side chamber, left carelessly on the floor rather than placed with any particular ceremony or respect, and had come to be known simply as the younger lady. When researchers ran genetic testing on the younger lady's remains and compared the results directly against Tutankhamun's own genetic profile, the match was unmistakable. Perfect, in the language researchers themselves used to describe it. This woman was Tutankhamun's biological mother, confirmed with the same level of genetic certainty that had already identified his father. But the data appearing on the laboratory screens that day revealed something considerably more unsettling sitting directly alongside that confirmation. This woman, Tutankhamun's own mother, was also his father's full sister. Sit with that finding directly, because it deserves real attention before moving any further into what it actually meant for the child born from that union. Tutankhamun was not simply the son of two closely related royal relatives, the way distant cousin marriages sometimes occurred throughout ancient royal families across many different cultures and centuries. He was the direct biological child of two full siblings, sharing both the same mother and the same father between them. That single genetic fact, confirmed directly in a museum basement laboratory more than 3,000 years after his birth, would go on to explain considerably more about Tutankhamun's short, painful life than any historical record ever could on its own. Tutankhamun was the direct biological child of two full siblings. Understanding what that actually meant for his life first requires understanding the cultural context that made such a union possible in the first place, without judging that context by standards it was never built to answer to. Sibling marriage within Egypt's royal family was not an isolated accident or a scandal kept quietly hidden. It was a deliberate, sustained practice carried out openly across multiple generations of Egyptian royalty. The reasoning behind it was twofold, and both threads mattered enormously to how ancient Egyptians understood their own royal family's place in the world. First, practically. Marrying within the immediate royal family kept political power and inherited wealth tightly consolidated, preventing outside families or rival factions from gaining influence over the succession through marriage alliances. Second, spiritually. Egyptian religious tradition held that the gods themselves married their own siblings, and a royal family claiming direct divine descent saw that same practice as a legitimate reflection of divine precedent playing out among mortals who ruled in the god's name. Within that specific cultural and religious framework, the marriage between Tutankhamun's parents was not considered scandalous or hidden. It was, by the standards of their own time, an entirely legitimate, even expected arrangement for a ruling royal family determined to preserve both political power and perceived divine purity within a single bloodline. But biology does not make exceptions for royal status or religious conviction or political necessity. Sibling marriage carries a specific, well-documented biological consequence, regardless of the cultural framework surrounding it. It dramatically increases the likelihood that harmful recessive genes, carried silently by both parents without causing them any noticeable harm individually, will end up duplicated directly in their children, since siblings already share a considerably larger proportion of their genetic material than unrelated parents ever would. When that duplication occurs, genetic disorders that might otherwise remain rare and unlikely become considerably more probable to actually appear in the resulting offspring. This is not a matter of ancient superstition or modern moral judgment layered backward onto the past. It is a simple, consistent biological reality, one that applies exactly the same way regardless of whether the parents involved happen to rule an empire or live in complete obscurity. Tutankhamun's own body carried the direct cost of that specific biological reality, and it carried that cost visibly, in ways that CT scans and genetic analysis would eventually reveal with a level of clarity ancient Egyptian physicians could never have possessed themselves. The elegant, powerful young man depicted across temple walls and painted tomb murals, standing tall, commanding, physically flawless in every artistic representation that has survived from his own era, turns out to have been something closer to a carefully constructed illusion. A royal portrait built specifically to project strength and divine legitimacy, rather than an honest physical record of the actual young man living underneath that carefully maintained public image. The real physical toll of his genetic inheritance was considerably more severe and considerably more painful than any tomb painting was ever designed to show the wider world. And modern science, working directly from his own preserved remains, was about to reveal exactly how severe that toll genuinely was. CT scans and genetic analysis, once finally applied directly to Tutankhamun's remains, revealed a physical condition considerably more severe than any temple painting had ever suggested. His left foot showed a deformity known as clubfoot, a structural malformation present from birth. Worse, part of the bones within that same foot showed clear evidence of necrosis, tissue death, breaking down slowly over the course of his short life. This was not a minor inconvenience. It would have caused genuine, constant pain and made ordinary walking extraordinarily difficult without direct physical support. When researchers first opened Tutankhamun's tomb decades earlier, they found something that had long puzzled Egyptologists: 130 separate walking sticks, crafted from materials including ivory and ebony, buried alongside him. For years, these were interpreted symbolically, treated as ceremonial objects representing royal authority and status, rather than anything practical. Modern science told a considerably different story. Those canes were never simply symbols. They were necessities. Tutankhamun was a genuinely disabled young man, physically unable to walk without support, living every day with real, chronic physical pain. Even the artistic record itself, once examined carefully, quietly confirmed this. While other Egyptian pharaohs were traditionally depicted standing during hunting or archery scenes, projecting strength and physical command, Tutankhamun appears seated in his own tomb paintings instead. That was never simply an artistic choice or a matter of personal preference. It reflected his actual physical reality. So what, finally, killed him? In 2005, imaging technology conclusively proved that the hole in his skull, the detail that had fueled decades of murder theories, had actually been created during the mummification process itself, not by any blow delivered before death. The assassination theory was, at last, definitively closed. But his actual cause of death remained genuinely unknown until researchers searched specifically for evidence of infectious disease within his preserved tissue. What they found completed the picture entirely. DNA belonging to Plasmodium falciparum, the most dangerous strain of malaria, was present directly in his body, among the oldest confirmed genetic evidence of malaria ever identified anywhere. Evidence suggested he had likely contracted it multiple separate times throughout his short life. In an otherwise healthy person, malaria alone is not always fatal, but Tutankhamun was never healthy to begin with. He was already living with a genetically weakened immune system, deteriorating foot bones, and chronic infection from ongoing necrosis. Scans revealed one final, crucial detail. Shortly before his death, Tutankhamun had broken his left leg just above the knee, a serious, unhealed injury, likely an open wound at the time of his death. The full picture finally became clear. Not murder, but a genuine cascade of misfortune. A body already weakened by inherited genetic disease, chronic bone deterioration, a sudden severe fracture, and then, at the worst possible moment, a violent malaria infection. His compromised system simply could not survive. His story marked the end of an entire dynasty. DNA, testing on 2 small mummified fetuses, found in a modest box within his own tomb, confirmed they were his daughters, likely born to his wife and probable half-sister, Akhenaten. The genetic burden proved too severe. Tutankhamun's line could not produce a surviving heir, and Egypt's brightest royal dynasty ended, quite literally, in his own body. Beneath the gold mask and the divine titles lies the record of a young man who could barely walk without support, who carried a genetically inherited disease burden severe enough that he and his wife could never produce a surviving heir, and whose entire dynasty ended with him, biologically, not simply politically. His successors tried to erase him from history entirely, scraping his name from temple walls, toppling his monuments, determined that the Amarna period and everyone connected to it would be forgotten. That erasure, by strange accident, is exactly what kept his tomb hidden from robbers for 3,000 years, intact enough for modern science to finally read what stone and gold alone never could. The mask gave the world a legend. The DNA gave it back a person. Subscribe for the next investigation.